experienced a revolution in tank design and production. As Hitler's army swept through Europe, America transformed itself from an isolationist backwater to an industrial giant, producing vast numbers of tanks to challenge the Axis forces. Its war-winning weapon was the Sherman. September 1916, the British Army unleashed a secret arsenal of devastating weapons. The German press called them the Devil's Coaches, but back in Britain they were heralded as the key to winning the war. Many soldiers shared this belief and were willing to endure toxic fumes, deafening noise and poor visibility to use this new weapon, the tank. Unlike France and Britain, by 1917, America had not developed its own tanks, nor had it been exposed to tank warfare before it joined the Allies on the Western Front. But US generals did draw one definite conclusion from what they had seen on the battlefields of northern France.
The experience that the Americans brought back from the First World War was the tank existed to support the infantry, and that's essentially what it was used for in the First War. So all the American thought, doctrine, development goes into an infantry tank. It's taken to such an extreme that in 1920 the Americans abolished the tank corps and they hand over tanks and tank development to the infantry.
Aircraft are coming to the fore at the end of the Great War. Both the US Army and the US Navy are trying to develop air power, and so there's lots of inter-service rivalry, and lots of the limited money that's available goes towards air power rather than towards army.
So during the 1920s and 30s, tank development was not considered a priority. Some prototypes were developed, but even these were subject to severe constraints.
American tank development really is stagnant until the 1930s. Even then, when they start to think again about tank development, they still can't produce anything which is more than about 15 tons in weight, because that's what American bridging equipment will take.
By the late 1930s, America's tank arsenal consisted of a few hundred light tanks left over from the First World War.
Got to lose.
Although there was no pressure to kickstart medium tank development, designers did look at the latest technologies.
Right up to the outbreak of the war in September of 1939, American armoured forces are very much focused on light tanks. And in fact, they passed up really the J. Walter Christie suspension system, which of course appeared on in the medium tank range.
But Christie suspension was actually a pretty good system. The British used it for one of their tanks, and the Dutch used it. The Americans didn't, probably because it was a little bit over-engineered. In some ways it was a bit ahead of its time. Also was very noisy and squeaky, so the element of secrecy would have been lost if you'd used Christie suspension.
As US government struggled with the Great Depression during the 1930s, military spending slumped even further. With less money to go round, the US Army favoured light tanks because they were cheaper to produce and because they could replace the cavalry horse.
The two cavalry divisions by the early 1930s had realised that cavalry had probably had its day, when they were very reluctant about that. But for them, obviously, that meant that cavalry's primary function of going rapidly behind enemy lines, disrupting enemy communications, that could be best served through a light tank, and that's what, of course, America went for, which was the M2, which could travel at 37 miles per hour, but was very much undergunned and very much under-armoured. So, although, as I say, it was good on blitz, it wasn't very good on Krieg at the end of the day. It's very good on the sort of speed factor.
So by 1939, the US finally had its own tank ready for production, and a mechanised cavalry brigade was created. Amid intelligence of a newly formed German tank division, there was pressure for the brigade to be organised along the same lines. But American generals did not see war as an imminent threat. Summer of 1939, Germany stunned the world by invading Austria, Czechoslovakia and Poland. By the summer of 1940, the Germans had invaded the Low Countries and had completely annihilated the French forces. The British, who fought alongside the French, were forced to abandon their tanks on the beaches at Dunkirk. Nobody could understand how Germany managed to crush its opponents when its tanks were no stronger than those of Britain or France.
So much better than the British or the French is not because they've got more tanks, not because they've got better tanks, but because they know how to use them as part of an integrated whole. And that lesson is taken up by the British class down to the other lesson is that it's no good having a nippy little tank with very little armour and a pea shooter for a gun. You needed a tank with a decent punch, and it needed to have sufficient armour to withstand what the Germans were going to throw at you. themselves, people were very reluctant to accept that. It is always very difficult to say that something you have believed in for years, that you have trained for, you've practiced, is actually not correct. And it took quite a lot of time for people to realise that it wasn't just the German tanks were beaten, much as the order was on to be overcome, or went to the war. The German tactics were better.
By April 1941, a new medium tank was leaving the production line. Named after the Confederate General Robert E. Lee, the M3 had a 7-man crew. In addition to its 75mm gun, the M3 also mounted a 37mm gun, as well as 4 machine guns. Its armour was up to 37mm thick. Its right radial engine gave it a 340 brake horsepower, a range of 120 miles, and a top road speed of 26 miles per hour. The UK bought 600 M3 tanks and called them the General Grant. The main selling point of the M3 was a much heavier armament to match the German tanks, which had proved so successful in the Battle for France. The main gun was not mounted in the turret, but in a sponson on the right-hand side of the hull, but it could only move 15 degrees up and down.
When the Lee Grant comes in, it's always been the concept that as soon as we have a turret that can take a 75mm gun, that is what we move on to. So in a sense, Lee Grant was always a stopgap.
Discover the past with exclusive military history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians. Or with your mobile device. Down? With the band of brothers to Operation Barbarossa and D-Day. Immerse yourself in the dramatic stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
The Lee Grant played a crucial part in the North African campaign, earning the title Egypt's Last Hope. But it proved unable to deal with the Panzer IV and was eventually replaced by the Shark. Its wartime career did not end there, though. In 1944, a number of Lees were sent to the mountainous jungles of Burma, where they helped the Allies defeat the Japanese army.
The 42 desperately needed a proper turret-mounted 75mm gun. 75mm being the smallest size rig that could fire a practically impossible high explosive shell. It had to have a punch, not only did it have to have a punch, but it had to have a range. One of the problems of all British tanks was that they didn't have the protection that they needed against their equivalent German tanks, and they didn't have a gun that would go through German armour. So all the time our thinking is we need more armour, we need a bigger gun. That isn't as easy as it sounds, because bigger gun, more armour means more weight, therefore means more powerful engine, and might mean less maneuverability.
What the Allies needed was a tank that could be built in large numbers by a civilian workforce. Not only did it need to be effective in battle, but it needed to be easy to operate and maintain. So designers came up with a medium tank they hoped would fit the bill. The Americans called it the M4, but the British named it Sherman.
Well, I mean, it really replaces the Grant. It comes along as the successor to the Grant, as a medium infantry tank for the US Army. And it's going to be the most important tank manufactured in the United States, and one of the most important tanks in World War II.
The M4, or Sherman medium tank, had a 5-man crew. Beside its main 75mm gun and the turret, the Sherman also mounted 3 machine guns, as well as a 50.8mm smoke mortar. Its armour was up to 100mm thick. Its Ford V8 engine meant it was capable of a range of 100 miles, a brake horsepower of 500, and a top road speed of 26 miles per hour.
that's one of its great selling features. I think for both the British and ultimately for the Americans.
The Sherman uses quite a lot of the Lee Grant features. It uses the same suspension, initially uses the same engine, uses the same transmission. The big difference is that the Sherman has a cast iron and later a welded hull, which is much safer than having one that's riveted.
The only real difference is with the deletion of the scope hatches, which provided a weakness in the armour, and which were rapidly recognised actually wanted somehow increasing crew survival by enabling them to get out. And the greater if the shell didn't get in the first place.
With orders pouring in, US tank factories were under enormous pressure to produce Shermans quickly, cheaply, and in large numbers. Although the Chrysler plant in Detroit was geared up for mass production, many factories had to be built from scratch. And because the Sherman inherited many features of the Lee Grant, existing assembly lines could be easily adapted, now causing hydraulic production.
I think the thing about the Sherman tank as well is that it's a reliable tank that can be manufactured relatively quite very easily. And we can see that by the numbers that it's produced. Some historians have put the figures as around about 49,000 to 50,000. There are figures which claim as many as 58,000 of these tanks were produced. Either way, they produce more Shermans in the United States than the entire German wartime production of tanks.
Service with the British 8th Army in Egypt in the autumn of 1942. After months of bitter fighting against Rommel's army, the men were demoralised and exhausted.
Together in a same-game multi.
The British General Montgomery faced a big situation. He needed to prepare his men to stage a final battle to kick the Axis out of Egypt once and for all. The arrival of 300 Shermans could not have been more timely.
I mean, the Sherman performs very well in the Western Desert. There are already Sherman tanks with the British 8th Army at El Alamein, and they do extremely well. And they're clearly a match for any of the Italian tanks, and also I would argue for most of the German armour that's in the theatre as well. So it starts off well with its 75mm gun and a reliable engine and technically and mechanically a reliable tank.
The Sherman arrives just in time for the Second Battle of Alamein, and in fact there are 300 of them when that battle starts, and they were generally welcome. Everybody said, whoopee, at last we've got a decent tank. Very quickly, Montgomery is writing to the War Office saying this new miracle tank isn't actually all it's cracked up to be, because it's only just a match for the Mark IV. And given that German tactics at this stage are still a lot better than ours are, the Mark IV versus the Sherman, the Mark IV will generally win.
When the Sherman started to enter service, really the Panzer III, which is one of the principal threats that had been taken into account when it was being designed, was becoming obsolete and was being replaced by the later versions of the Panzer IV, the long-barreled gun. This immediately put the Sherman at a disadvantage because the Sherman only had a short to medium length weapon at the time, didn't have the muzzle velocity.
But as crews got to know the Sherman's strengths, they also discovered its limitations.
I think right from the beginning, it was realised that the high silhouette of the Sherman was a disadvantage. Now, admittedly, it at least did have its main armament in the turret on the top, which the Grant, or the Lee Grant, did not. But even so it was still a very high tank, and that was undoubtedly a disadvantage. How did the crews cope with it? They learned how to use ground, they learned how to camouflage. Perforce, they had to.
The high turret was never good. In some respects, in the open desert, you could see a tank anyway. It didn't really matter how high it was. The moment you were moving into more undulating terrain, the Sherman is less able to make use of small undulations than lower tanks are.
The high silhouette of the Sherman is a problem. It's a problem for any tank design, and particularly when you've got very effective German anti-tank defences, and the 88mm is a very effective weapon. This whole profile of the Sherman is a problem for it, and in part it's going to account for the losses that it's going to sustain in combat.
Was that the Sherman was built to withstand 37mm armour-piercing ammunition. But when the Germans started using their 88mm anti-aircraft gun to knock out tanks, the Sherman's thin armour made it extremely vulnerable to catching fire. This weakness earned the Sherman unfortunate nicknames. The Germans called it the Tommy Cooker, and the Allies called it the Lumsen, the lighter, because it always lived first time.
The Sherman had one weakness that it was famous for, and this was as tank crews say, its ability to brew up, its catch fire. The battlefields were often littered with burning Shermans, very distinctive and very distressing sight. What the Sherman's problem was the ammunition stowage. The ammunition was stowed too high up, and what tended to happen is that either a penetrating tank hit, or indeed in some places just a tank hit on the outside of the hull, would transmit shock through and it would rupture, cordite, and that would catch fire and cause terrible fires.
Despite these problems, British and American crews had many reasons to be pleased with the Sherman.
The introduction of the three-turret crew on the Sherman, another major factor in its success. It was the key to German success. And once everybody else adopted it, the Russians adopted it on the T-34-85. The whole point of having three crew members was the fact that the loading and firing of the gun were kept separate from the commander. The commander could direct all his attention to focusing the firepower and the manoeuvre of the tank, finding the targets, focusing them, doing the manoeuvre, and that is the key to successful tank warfare.
In December 1941, the United States declared war on the Axis. In what became known as Operation Torch, troops landed in North Africa the following November. But by early 1943, the American army was impatient to take on the African Corps, which by this time had been pushed back to Tunisia. By this stage of the long desert campaign, the differences between the hardened British tank crews and their American counterparts really began to show.
That 50 caliber Browning that they have mounted on the top of the American Shermans, which is ostensibly an anti-aircraft weapon. The British say, well, that's nice, we don't want that. So they take it off, so they get rid of that.
I think the great difference between American and British tank crews, America's entry into the war after the Operation Torch landings in North Africa in November 1942, is of course the British tank crews by this stage are very experienced, and they know what the Germans can do. The American tank crews are inexperienced and have no idea what the Germans can do. And it's because of that inexperience that the Americans had this terrible disaster at Kasserine Pass, which is the first major clash between German armour and American armour, and the Americans come out of it very badly.
1,000 men were killed at Kasserine Pass. Hundreds were taken prisoner, and most of their tanks were destroyed. The Americans relied on the M3 Lee Grant tank during the battle, which proved completely ineffective against the fearsome 88mm anti-tank gun. It was a turning point for the US Army. Commanders were changed, tank strategy was radically transformed, and the Lee Grant was replaced some fronts, the adaptability of the Sherman allowed innovation that saved countless lives. One of the most useful variants to emerge from the desert campaign was the Sherman crab.
The latter part of the Desert War, principally due to the enormous casualties we took in combat engineering during the early part of the war, and the essential need to provide means of overcoming various obstacles.
There were a number of Sherman variants, and one was the crab, as it was known, the flail tank. This had a roller on the front of the tank with links of chain, and was used for clearing minefields. And